Evening everyone, this is Svidler with the highlights video for the final game of the classical portion of the World Championship match in London between Magnus Carlsen and Caruana. Fabiano was white for today's game, and we expected him to go for as sharp a game as possible in order to maximize his chances of ending the game in the classical portion. Once again, the consensus is that he starts a significant, although obviously not an insurmountable underdog if the match were to go into the rapid portion. So let's have a look at what happened today. Once again, Fabio opened with 1e4, c5, knight f3, knight c6, no surprises, d4. He's been doing that in the entire second half of the match. Takes, knight f6, knight c3, e5. Once again, we have the Sveshnikov. Once again, we have the 7th knight d5, and this is where Magnus deviates first by going knight e7 instead of knight b8, as he played in the previous two black games in this match. c4, knight g6, queen a4, bishop d7, queen b4, bishop f5, h4. And previously black used to play 7 a6 in this position with sharp but sort of reasonably well explored positions arising after that. White can, for instance, start with h5 here. But Magnus blitzed out h7, h5. And here Fabi started thinking, and he went quite seriously into the tank here, which was frankly somewhat surprising and prompted Alexander Grishuk, when he finally joined the show, to term White's preparation for this game as, you know, yet another piece of miserable preparation with the white pieces. I think that's maybe a bit harsh, but there was a recent game between Svidler and Stockfish in which this move was played, and these days completely ignoring these computer competitions seems unwise, because your opponent probably will not. The most obvious move in the position is, of course, bishop g5, after which black plays queen b8, let's say bishop e2, a6, knight c3, queen c7. And black is now finally prepared to play bishop f8, e7. It's worth noting that the immediate bishop e7 is bad, because you'll have to take with the king, and the king also has to continue going forward. And here white gets an advantage after both, let's say, d5, d6 and knight b5, d6. Both moves are quite strong. Which is why black takes this somewhat circuitous route to ensure bishop e7 is possible. White, for instance, can play g3, bishop e7, and in this position the best move arguably is actually going back, because black is threatening to take on g5 and play h5, h4. And after bishop e3 and knight f8, we get to this interesting position, which originally the computer assesses as significantly better for white, but actually it's probably not that clear at all. White probably should at some point play knight a4, black goes knight d7, here you should castle, forcing black to either spend a tempo on bishop g6, after which he will finally go knight b6, or black could also potentially castle, just giving up the pawn on h5. If you try swapping the knights off and then picking the pawn, it ends in an immediate draw, because black has a return tactical shot, bishop takes h4, gh and bishop g4, and the bishop is caught on h5, so you will have to take and allow this perpetual. And if you take on h5 immediately, the machine suggests black probably plays bishop d3, attacking the pawn on c4, but mainly just preparing for e5, e4. Now black wants to go knight d7, e5, and if white goes knight b6, the machine goes rook a, e8. And now black obviously has very, very decent counterplay on the king side for the sacrificed pawn. And I have a suspicion some kind of a position like this was looked at quite deeply by Team Carlsen, because he was playing very quickly, and also you will see later in the game that this is exactly the setup he was aiming for. After h4, h5, Fabiano played queen a4, bishop d7, queen b4, bishop f5. And here obviously we were very seriously alarmed, because if white goes queen a4 one more time, the game will just finish in a threefold by move 15, which is obviously, as spectators, we were not very much in favor of in the studio. And Fabiano proves that, you know, you cannot fault his fighting spirit. We knew that about him even before this match, but he did not disappoint once again. He played bishop e3 here, which is a version of the same. There are obviously some differences with the bishop g5 lines, but in general, the positions lead to very similar. This move leads to very similar situations on the board. a6, knight c3, queen c7, g3, bishop e7. And notably, if you play bishop f1, e2 here, this is exactly the position we were discussing when we were discussing the bishop g5 move, just via a slightly different move order, and we would get here one move later because of the inclusion of queen a4, queen b4. But Fabi had a different setup in mind. He played f3, to which Magnus more or less instantly replied with knight f8, because once again, the speed with which he played knight f8 here, I think, indicates that that was sort of always the plan, to transfer the knight from g6 to f8 to d7, and then black has additional plans of, let's say, bishop g6, f5 in good positions, but in general, the knight just belongs on d7, it doesn't belong on g6, whereas you can see it was very severely restricted by the structure. So knight f8, and now knight e4, knight d7, and bishop d3. And we were mildly curious during the broadcast, but not curious enough to actually check. But this is a kind of I'm pretty sure this is a world record in World Championship matches where by move 20, and this is now move 20, black to play, none of the sides has castled yet. But Magnus finally does castle kingside here. And I took a reasonably serious look in this position because Fabiano's choice was very, very striking and very interesting, but objectively I think not the best. And we'll come to what he played in a moment, but let's go through the options. I mean, one normal option would be to play something like queen d2, and this move will return later, but I think it should be connected with castling kingside. And if after bishop queen d2 black plays bishop g6, which I believe is probably stronger than b7, b5. After b5, the machine goes rook c1. And there are some weird lines, as usual, the machine shows here, but I think the conclusion is it is white who will be pressing for advantage. So bishop g6, and here white probably should castle, and that transposes to the position we'll discuss later. And if you continue waiting with the castling, black can now start very serious counterplay by playing f5, taking on g5, playing e4, and after bishop e2, it's very notable that the machine goes f5, f4. Because if you take on f3 and go knight e5, which looks very natural, after castles knight f3 and rook f3, first line of the machine, even at a very, very shallow depth, is to play f5, f4 even here, because you really need to somehow revive this bishop on g6. But the immediate f4 is even stronger. White has to take with the pawn, because if you take with the bishop, black can get a ton of immediate play, because white will have to abandon the hopes of castling properly. So you take with the pawn, and now black goes knight c5 to make sure that he always has fe4, knight takes e4. Let's say castles and rook e8. And unsurprisingly, the machine thinks black has full compensation for the pawn. Probably not more, but definitely a full compensation. And in view of all that, probably it's better to just castle here, and after bishop g6, just play queen d2, or in the other way, in the other move order. And in this position, black actually has to play accurately to equalize, but he probably does equalize after f5. Once again, b5 rook ac1 is really playing into white's hands. You don't really want to open the files on the queen side when you don't have a good follow-up. But after f5, knight g5, bishop g5. Now there's a sort of a fork in the road, and it is here stronger to take with the bishop. If you take with the pawn, e4, bishop e2, ef. If you take on f3 with the bishop, black picks up the pawn on c4, obviously, and if you take with the rook, black goes knight e5, and here rook f8, with the intention of playing queen e7, and then knight f7, and the pawn on g5 is actually somewhat vulnerable, which I believe should give black enough counterplay for a decent position. But if you take with the bishop, e4, bishop e2, ef, white takes with the rook, and let's say after rook e8, white goes bishop f4, and the machine assesses this position as somewhat better for white, perhaps even significantly better for white. Black obviously can wait for a while and not play f5 so early, but it's not immediately obvious what other types of counterplay he even has, and white, if not pushed, will go rook a c1, obviously will play b4 if allowed, and start pushing for the standard plans with the c5 break. And also, in some cases, as Fabiano himself has shown, he might choose to switch to some play on the king side with g4 if black is, passive and not doing anything for a long enough period of time to allow white to prepare for something. But once again, the feeling was that Fabiano today was not really interested in these kind of restrained approaches. And we started looking at ideas of castling queenside during the live show even. And castling queenside immediately here was probably stronger than what Fabiano did. I'm pretty sure it was. Because after b5, king b1, black has an option of playing bc4, and after rook c1 the position is quite sharp but also very unclear. Or black can wait for a move with bishop g6, and then the machine goes cb5, ab5, rook c1, queen b7, and there is never really a good time to take on b5 in these positions because of how strong knight f6 is. But the machine just goes queen b3, f5, knight g5. It leads to an incredibly messy position as well, but white is not worse here. And if black tries to play the same way he did in the game, let's say bishop g6, I think it's reasonably clear that having this tempo already, the king can already start running towards the corner. You will be better off here with white compared to what Fabiano got in the game. And in the game, after some serious thought, Fabi went for the move rook h2, which clearly prepares castling queenside and then meeting the b5 counterplay with rook c2. It's an interesting concept, but because black is not obliged to play b5 really at any point until it's really, really well prepared, it ends up being a waste of a tempo, basically. And Fabi was also running reasonably short on time. I'm not entirely sure how much time he had left here, but he was significantly behind on the clock compared to what Magnus was, and also did not really have that much time objectively. Magnus played rook a c8. You can even play immediately bishop g6, long castles f5, knight g5, takes, and d4. And here, somewhat significantly, already here, the computer suggests that the only move for white to kind of stay in the game and not be immediately worse is bishop f1, with the intention of meeting ef with bishop f4. Once again, completely entombing this bishop on g6, not allowing it to enter the game. And yeah, this is a mess. After knight e5, the machine goes c5, and I decided not to investigate very much further because it really has very little relevance to what happened in the game, but it should give you an impression of how energetically computer plays with white in these positions just to stay alive. Magnus instead played rook a c8, Fabi castled as expected, and Magnus quietly went bishop g6, which is a very strong move actually. And now a very, very direct idea of playing f5 and e4 is extremely strong and very, very difficult to parry. If you start with king b1, black goes f5, and here the best move arguably maybe is knight g2, because after knight g5, takes, e4, some kind of a position like fe4, knight e5, bishop e2, and here, for instance, knight g4, knight takes, bishop takes g4, and fg. They are seriously better for black. White will have to work really hard not to collapse on the spot. And after knight g2, once again e4, and here white's position is so awkward that the machine suggests actually just giving up the pawn on c4 and playing this position. But it is a position where black has a healthy extra pawn, so it has very little to recommend itself if you're hoping to play for a win with white. Fabi played rook c2, sort of finishing his intended setup. Magnus played f5, knight went to f2. This is still actually not as horrible as we thought during the live show, and we fully expected him to play knight g5, but after taking, he would have to take with the pawn, because if you take with the bishop after knight c5, f4, and simply b7, b5, the machine starts thinking already here that white is close to completely lost, due to a very, very strong threat of, let's say white makes some kind of waiting move and black just plays a5 here. You can never take because of bishop e8. You will see this motif later as well. And if you have to play some kind of position like this, you kind of know you will not enjoy it. So hg, and here black goes e4. Let's say once again bishop f1, and here once again the same motif, refreshing, rejuvenating the bishop on g6. Bishop takes, knight c5, fe, and in this position I left the machine running for a while, and it suggested that you play a6, a5 here. Somewhat surprisingly to me, the best square for this queen is d2. And in this position, the computer once again doesn't even hurry to take on e4, goes rook ce8, and says black is, despite currently being 2 pawns down, and we all understand that the pawn on e4 is a dead man walking, but still, currently black is 2 pawns down, and the machine evaluation is around -1. So not really that much fun for Fabiano at all. Instead of all this, Fabiano played knight f2, Magnus played knight c5, and here Fabio made a mistake which, under normal circumstances, had this not been game 12, because really that's the only explanation for what is about to follow. I think that move should have cost him the game. He played f3, f4, which we also sort of expected in the studio. It really does make sense to lock the bishop on g6 down, but the move has very, very serious tactical problems connected with it. Instead of that, he had to make an extremely ugly move, bishop takes c5, d takes. There's also a possibility of taking with the queen and playing this endgame, which the machine also evaluates as better for black. Or dc5, queen e1, bishop d6 and king b1. And once again, there is no doubt that white will be in full defensive mode for the rest of the game, but maybe he survives. After f4 though, black has a very pleasant choice of playing either b7, b5 immediately, which is once again re-establishing this idea of a5, bishop e8, in a situation where obviously you cannot take because you are blundering mate in 3, or 2, or whatever. And white is more or less helpless here. Like in this position, the machine suggests, once again, going for some kind of structure like this, and after queen d7, you have to say that this probably is going to fall apart for white. It's very difficult to imagine white surviving this position. And there is an additional option after f4 of taking on f4 and giving white a choice between this position, where, you know, to go with all the problems on the queen side, which did not really disappear. Black now has an actual passed extra pawn on the king side. Or you can take with the bishop, and now black plays b5. And here, even bishop takes c5 is no longer available to you, so you will have to play some kind of a position like this, which once again is extremely cheerless and just plain bad for white. Instead, Magnus played a5, and this is a normal move, but when I saw a5, in particular in connection with the next move e5, e4, which you shouldn't criticize, it's a good move, but you could also maintain the tension for now with bishop f6 here, for instance. I got this feeling that Magnus is actually not actively looking for ways to win this, but he is setting up this pawn structure where white really will never have any attacking possibilities at all, and black is fully in control of what's going on the board. And he was doing that with a view of just making sure he cannot lose, and that he felt was, you know, a perfectly good enough result for the game. And it is clearly, you know, a case of Magnus getting, you know, very heavily influenced by the match situation, because I'm pretty sure that under normal circumstances he would immediately appreciate that he is much better, and he would be actively looking for ways to convert that position into a full point, in particular because he throughout the game stayed very much in control on the clock, and Fabio was running reasonably short on time, and it's not an easy position to play with white on, let's say, 15 minutes. Bishop a4 is currently a very strong idea, so white played king b1. to at least be able to play b3 here, so that there are no forks. Magnus replied bishop f6. Now bishop d4 is completely impossible because this tactic once again wins a lot of material on the spot. And in this position, objectively, bishop a4 probably is a very strong threat. And Fabio made a move rook e1, which we sort of expected during the live show, because it felt like you were sidestepping the bishop a4 threats. But there's really no time for that for white. And the machine suggests that if you play knight h3 here, your position may not be so horrible, because at least it stops black from winning the game on the spot, so to speak. If black goes bishop a4, b3, takes, knight b3, very importantly, the queen goes to e1, where it controls the e1, a5 diagonal. And a4 doesn't really create any threats, because once again, the queen cannot really join the attack. So white goes knight g5, and here the machine already says white is completely winning. So black has to play b5. The only move is c5, but it's the only move you would ever make. Let's say knight takes, rook d c1, and as usual, the machine says this is a 0-0-0 position, which you can only meet that with a shrug. 0-0, okay, this is a 0-0 position. So after knight h3, the machine goes g6, knight g5, bishop d7, and says black is better, but at least, once again, at least white prevented losing on the spot. And notably, a very important consideration for both this position and for the future. If white goes knight a6, black always takes with the bishop to preserve this incredibly strong blockading knight on c5, and then just protects the pawn on d6, and eventually comes after the e6 pawn. And after rook e1, and I have a feeling this is also a poor square. I suspect something like g1 was actually stronger in view of what black can do in this position. Rook e1 is basically a losing move. If Magnus played bishop a4 here, I'm pretty sure he would have won the game. b3 is just bad here because black takes, and now you have to play the queen to a really horrible square on d1. And this construction is about as awkward as white can place his pieces in this position, because the knight cannot go back to d1 to participate in the defense. And after a5, a4, very simple threats of queen a5 followed by b5. White's position will just collapse. It doesn't remotely feel like white has an extra piece here. It does feel, though, that black will give mate. Therefore, after bishop a4, I'm pretty sure Fabio was planning to go rook c c1. That was one more c there than was necessarily required. And black just goes b7, b5. We did not see that idea during the live show, but we were very actively looking, let's say, for options to play rook b8. But this is not fast enough. Here, after knight d1, b5, and bishop takes c5, the position is actually not that clear. But bishop a4, connecting the rooks, rook c1, b5, c takes b5, and queen b6. I think had Magnus been sort of actively looking for ideas like this, he first of all would have spotted this, and secondly, I find it extremely unlikely that he would not have won this position, because white is more or less completely helpless to preserve the pawn on b5, and once it falls, his position just falls completely apart, because the attack along the b file connected with a tremendously strong bishop on f6, plus the fact that every single endgame will be winning for black because of how weak the pawn on d5 will be and how strong the protected passer on e4 is. This is just crushing for black. For instance, bishop d4, simply bishop b5 is very strong, but you can also go slower and take on d4 and then b5. And white more or less never has any time to take on h5 here. In this position, somewhat stunningly, one of the moves the computer says is winning is the simple knight a4 with the intention of slowly winning this endgame. Once again, the pawn on d5 is very, very weak. But also after rook b8, the machine says black is more or less completely winning. Just not quickly, eventually. Or you can go bishop takes b5 immediately, bishop f6, gf6, once again keeping the rooks connected. And if you don't take on h5, you will die slowly. And if you do take on h5 after bishop d3 check, you will die quite quickly, because you know, not much explanation is needed for this position, I feel, because rook b8 is going to follow, forcing white to play b3. Then we open up more files on the queen side. Mate is really not very far off. And if white doesn't take on d3 and plays king a1, a5, a4 creates a more or less unstoppable threat of knight b3 check, opening up the a file and giving mate. All in all, bishop a4 you have to count as simply winning for black, and Magnus would not have let go of his advantage of this position, in this position, I'm pretty sure. But instead he played a5, a4, which is not really a, like it's a move connected with the previous plan. It's not a bad move. It is a move that misses more or less a forced win. And in the previous highlight shows, I pointed out a number of positions where the machine says such and such is winning, and I would like to point out, and I have pointed out repeatedly, that some of those machine wins are very difficult to spot. But I think you only need to start looking at bishop a4 and b5 to understand just how crushingly strong it is. None of the variations I showed are particularly machine-like. It makes perfect sense for black to try and open the b file, and these two moves just do it in a very comfortable manner. Magnus played a4, Fabiano played queen b4 here. Bishop d4 we thought loses to knight b3, and it might also be quite decent, but knight d3 just wins more convincingly. This is like a typical shot in these positions. Black is attacking the rook on e1, and if you take on d3 with anything, you have given up your dark squared bishop for a knight, and black is just completely winning because this is just such a monster when it returns to f6. But it was objectively stronger in this position to play knight d1, and in general I was very surprised when Fabi did not make this move either here or on the next move, because the knight really does not belong on g5. It's doing nothing there. If you get it there, it's just stuck there doing nothing. Trying to bring it to c3 is a better idea, or perhaps if you're really hopeful, maybe you can aim for bishop d4 and knight e3. But anyway, Fabi played queen b4, Magnus played g7, g6, another kind of slow preparatory move, which you can sort of do without, but it's fine. And here, once again, knight d1 was stronger than what Fabiano did. You still need to aim for those squares. Fabi played rook d1, black played rook a8. And here I think Magnus had, I'm not entirely sure, between 35 and 40 minutes, I want to say. And Fabi was down to maybe 13-ish. 9 moves to go, maybe 15. And there was a longish pause here, and people in chat started suggesting that a draw offer has been made. And all three of us had, you know, great fun describing just how unlikely the idea that Magnus offered a draw in this position, or frankly in any position, is, because all three of us had the same experience of, I think, never having heard those three, that's 4 words I offer a draw, right? Those 4 words in that order during a tournament game. I don't believe we've ever heard them. Magnus is really very well known for never stopping play until there's play left on the board, and his definition of play left on the board is, you know, even a lot wider than most people. So we had a lot of fun discussing all that and saying, yeah, that did not happen, and also black is objectively still very much better here. And then on our screens, game over draw flashed, and we were left somewhat stunned because, I mean, generally speaking, this is extremely unlike Magnus to be doing this. His position is pretty much risk-free. He is ahead on the clock, and Fabi still has to be very, very careful, because if, as indicated by the move rook d1, if white continues with the same plan of, let's say, going knight h3, bishop d7, knight g5, rook fc8, you're stuck not doing very much, and black at some point will start preparing and achieving the b7, b5 break. For instance, if you play bishop d4 here, black can take, and the computer says you can even play queen a5. Very simply, prepare and play b7, b5 sort of next move, and to say that it dislikes this for white is to understate it quite severely. But nonetheless, the facts are that Magnus offered a draw here, and Fabi, to his credit, considered it quite seriously, even in this position. Apologies. This probably cost some of you your hearing, but I just couldn't do anything with it in time. Should have stopped speaking earlier. Once again, my apologies for the headphone users among you. I should remember which timestamp that was to include a health warning. Okay. Sorry about that. But what I wanted to say is that's a very, very unexpected draw for from the world champion. And the only way to explain it, I think, is to quote what I believe he said during the press conference, which once again, he probably wasn't very happy during that press conference because, you know, a chess player as good as he is, he must have felt that the position objectively deserved more than he gave. But he said that he just did not have the right mindset on the day to look for more than just a very solid setup and a draw once he got out of the opening with no problems. And yeah, that's really the only way to describe it, because if you're looking for advantage with black in the positions he had over the course of that game, you will find it. It's there, and it's not even a single line. There's a pretty much a choice for black of very, very pleasant positions, including the final one, which is very, very unpleasant for white to play. But Magnus decided that, and I don't mean here, I think Magnus just decided before the game even started that draw is just perfectly fine because of his perceived advantage in the shorter time controls over the challenger. And he just could not break that original setting in his head, so to speak. And despite his position clearly deserving more, he just made sure he does not lose and offer the draw. With that draw, the classical portion of the match ended 6-6. No decisive games. A lot can be said about what that does to the status of the World Championship matches, the way they are structured right now, but we've had a sort of long and free-ranging conversation on that topic during the live show, which I thought was quite interesting, and I'm not going to try to recap that as well. As for the match, there will now be rapid playoffs, which will be extremely exciting to watch. I remember the New York match in 2016, which I covered with Jan, and the day of the tiebreaks is very, very interesting and very exciting to cover, and promises a lot of very interesting chess. So be sure to join us then on Wednesday, same time. And on that, I will sign off. Thank you for watching. This has been Peter Svidler for Chess24.